Welcome back, everybody, to the Coffee and Podcast. I am your host, Philip Clayman. I'm one of the co-founders of Three Tree Coffee. And on this podcast, we are passionate about cultivating freedom for victims of human trafficking, all while drinking really great coffee. I'm really excited about today's episode. We actually flipped the script. And on today's episode, I asked you, the listeners, to ask me some questions. You're interviewing me about what does it mean to own a coffee shop and to run a coffee shop. And so I got some really awesome responses. I'm excited to dive into some of these questions, and let's get started. I frequently have people that, come up to me and say something like, "It must be so great running your own coffee shop." I actually had one time someone came up to me and they said, you are so lucky to have the opportunity to own a coffee shop, as if we just stumbled on it with some sort of fortune, right? And most of the time, I love it. It is absolutely great to run our own coffee shop. But sometimes people say these things, and on the inside, I'm screaming, "It's not what you think. It's not what you think." It is really difficult. There is so much that goes into running a coffee shop. And I actually was speaking with someone one time, and they said, it must be so nice getting just to sit in your coffee shop and drink some coffee every day at work. And, there are only a handful of times where I feel like I've had that moment where I'm sitting in a coffee shop and I think, wow, we're really building something awesome here. Most of the time, it's work, right? It's work. We're doing a lot of things. We're addressing a lot of issues. We're solving a lot of problems. And I love it. And it is absolutely worthwhile. But there's a lot that goes into running a coffee shop. And that's why I love some of your questions. Y'all really were digging into some of the nuances of what makes this difficult. Why don't more people do this? And I'm excited to address some of those. So we're going to start with our first question. And this question came from Kaylee. I'll go ahead and give her a shout out. She was one of our past managers. Thank you for the question, Kaylee. She said, "What were some of the first steps that you took when opening a coffee shop? What's the order of operations here? What do I do first?" And something that I would encourage, and it's definitely true with our story, is just research. It's amazing how much information we have at our fingertips these days. And just take the time to research all sorts of things about this industry. You can find most of what you need to know online. Doesn't mean you immediately have memorized it or are perfect at it, but you can learn a lot up front just by doing some really good research. And don't just research the things that you're interested in. If you really like coffee, don't just research how to make a really good cup of coffee. Research some of the other things you're not as comfortable in, like how to manage people, like how to raise funds and raise capital with investors. Do some of this research as well. Maybe you really like the financial side and that's what you're really strong at. Well, you need to know how to make a really good cup of coffee too. So you need to research those things as well. And so we spent so much time in the early days just researching. I think there was at least a year where we really didn't do anything. We were just researching. We were watching videos, reading articles, and trying to learn as much as we can. And it's amazing how much information is at our fingertips to do that. And so my first encouragement is just research, and that's a big part of our story. The next thing I would suggest that kind of falls in line with our story is just get experience. Get experience. If you are going into running a coffee shop totally cold on any experience about working in food service or leading people, it's going to be a pretty rude awakening. It is a lot of hard work. It's a lot of grind. It's difficult. And it takes the right personality and the right person for this to really fit for. So I'd rather people get comfortable with it first and make sure, verify that this is a good fit for me. So when I first got my start in coffee up in Athens, Georgia, worked at a coffee shop called Two Story. I wish it was still there, but it sadly has closed. But shout out to anyone that's listening to this who has worked at Two Story in the past, some of my friends. We had an awesome time working there. And it was really good experience for me to, one, refine the craft of coffee, but probably even more importantly, refine the craft of customer service, really get an understanding of the work that goes into running a shop, some of the minuscule things that maybe don't feel as important, but they're super important, like closing the shop really well and making sure it's really clean. It's amazing how important that is to running a really great shop. And you really can't understand that until you just work in it. And so if you're able to work at a coffee shop or even just a restaurant, do that first. Get the experience and make sure this is something that you are excited about and want to move forward in. I mentioned experience maybe in supervising people. I think that's the second most important experience that you should try and seek before you open a coffee shop. Maybe you've worked at a coffee shop before, maybe you've worked at a restaurant before. If you've never supervised or led people, that's also usually a rude awakening the first time you get into it, right? It can be really difficult. Lots of people are very different, and learning how to guide a very diverse group of people in a unified direction takes practice and skill. No one's born with it. It doesn't happen overnight. It takes practice. And so maybe you have an opportunity to be a supervisor in a work situation. Maybe, if in any industry you work in, if you have an opportunity to supervise people, take it. Get used to that up front. Maybe it's volunteering. Go to some local nonprofits and say, hey, I'd love to get involved. I'd love to oversee a group of volunteers. Any way that you can practice and learn being over a group of people, you're going to be better set up for success. The last step I would, that's almost necessary, right? So we spent so much time just researching what this means. What does it mean to open a coffee shop? And thankfully, we brought in some experience that helped us be prepared for that. Well, you reach a point where you got to kind of put pen to paper and make a plan. And that means making a business plan, right? And so I would say that another important step at the beginning, one that we did, is you got to write out what's your business plan. And this business plan is going to unpack everything about your business. What's the name? Who's the audience? What's the product you sell? How do you plan to sell it? Where do you plan to open this? You really just start mapping out all the details that can feel so overwhelming at first, but it's actually kind of comforting to throw it all on a piece of paper, kind of get it all out of your mind and get it on a piece of paper. And so start mapping out your business plan. Start answering the what, the who, the why, the where, all these questions. And that's going to help you really start to sift through, why is your coffee shop different? Why will this be successful? What makes your product unique? You're going to need this business plan to get investors. Anytime you go to get upfront capital to open a coffee shop, people are going to want to know what's your plan. I'm not just going to give you money you don't have a plan, right? Whether you get it from a bank or maybe some angel investors, people are going to want to know, how are you going to turn this around and make sure that my investment doesn't just get thrown away? And so not only does that business plan help you kind of map everything out, but it also is a really good tool to start building those connections and raising the capital you need up front. I remember when I was first writing our business plan for Three Tree, I was so nervous. I was like, I don't want to mess this up. I want it to be perfect, right? And if I learned anything through that process, and if I've learned anything with looking back at that original business plan now, 8 or 9 years later, trust me, it does not have to be perfect. And it will likely not go the way you plan. We had so many different plans that I look back on that sheet and I start laughing, because that's just not the direction that our business ended up going. The most obvious one being that we were only planning to be a coffee roasting company when we first started. And now we have 3 coffee shop locations. We're more about a direct consumer product than a wholesale or business to business relationship. And that was not the plan in the beginning. And so don't be afraid of it. Just go after it. Get the thoughts that are in your head on paper, start mapping things out, and it's going to start guiding you in the right direction. Let's move on to our next question. Carly, appreciate you submitting this question. You asked, how did we determine if the income would cover the expenses? All right. And if I'm being totally honest, we had no clue if the income would cover the expenses. All right. We put together a financial projection. I'll explain that in a minute. All right. But even then, it's a lot of guessing up front. How can you know? There is a lot of risk involved in taking this jump. And there's certainly steps you can take. I'm going to share a couple of things that may help get you there. But at the same time, you are never going to feel confident that it's going to work financially, ever. And anytime we've had any sort of expansion in Three Tree, not just the beginning, but adding on locations, purchasing the trolley, purchasing large pieces of equipment, I have never felt 100% sure this is going to work. So there's always risk involved. And especially at the beginning, it's kind of a guessing game. With that said, when we started Three Tree, I created a very basic break-even projection. I just wanted to know how many cups of coffee Or how many dollars per day do I have to make to just cover all my costs? Kind of like what the question's asking. That's called a break-even projection. And so I literally just started mapping out all my costs, right? What are all the costs that go into a coffee shop? This is where research is really important. You can find so much online. And I'll go and tell you now, there's more costs than you think. And not all costs are created equal. Some operate very differently than others. And so let me explain that a little bit. One of the costs that goes into running a coffee shop is obviously the cost of the ingredients. You got to buy milk, you got to buy coffee beans, you got to buy the cup, you got to buy syrups and flavors. All these ingredients go in the final product that you sell. Well, that's called your cost of goods sold or your cost of ingredients, okay? And so, when you're mapping out a cost of ingredients, it's almost always a percentage of the total sale because if I sell 1 cup of coffee, I had a certain amount of costs. If I sell 2 cups of coffee, I have twice that amount of costs. The costs move very dynamically with how many sales do we have. So the good news about that is that if I'm not selling very many cups of coffee, well, I'm not buying that many gallons of milk. It keeps the cost kind of safe. The bad news is that the more you sell, the more expenses you get, right? But that one's pretty easy to project because there's just some percentages that you're going to want to try and stick to. Usually in the food service industry, people try to keep the cost of goods sold between 30, 33%. Some try to push it lower, some try to keep it higher. And that's 30 to 33% of your gross sales. So how much do you sell? So to give an example, if I sell $10 of product in a day, I want all the ingredients that went into that product to be around $3, maybe $3.30. So that was one of the costs that I had in our break-even projection, and that's called a variable cost. It's moving with the amount of sales. If you sell more, there's more costs. Well, another type of expense or a cost is called a fixed cost. It does not change depending on how much you sell. It's going to be the same no matter what. And a great example of this is rent, right? If you are moving into a coffee shop location, you're opening a shop at a new place, you're going to negotiate some sort of rent agreement with a landlord for probably 5+ years, and that's set. Once you sign that contract, there's not much turning back, and it's not going to change whether you sell 1 cup of coffee or you sell 100 cups of coffee. And so we mapped that out as well. What are some of our fixed costs that don't change, right? And we mapped those out as well, like rent, like maybe insurance would be another good example. And the last type of cost is something called step costs. And so these aren't as fluid as variable costs, right? It's not like if you sell 1 more cup, you have that much more expenses, but they're also not fixed. And the best example of this is labor costs, right? You're going to have to staff a certain amount of people to work this coffee shop. And let's say you have 3 people working the coffee shop at a certain time. Well, you could probably sell a certain amount of cups of coffee. Let's say you can sell 50 cups of coffee in an hour with 3 people there. That's actually a lot. Let's change it up. Maybe it's 25 cups of coffee in an hour with 3 people there. Well, you could probably sell more with the same amount of people. Maybe you get up to 30 cups, same amount of people are working it. Maybe you get up to 35 cups, same amount of people are working it. But at some point, you're selling enough cups more that it takes a step up. We need to staff an extra person. We need to go from 3 baristas to 4. That's one of the ways that a step cost kind of changes over time. It's kind of bigger gaps is when it changes. Another area where this changes with labor is raises and pay changes and things like that. All that's going to affect labor, and it's not completely correlated with sales. It's kind of independent of sales, and decisions have to be made at certain points to say, when do we add more people or not? So we put together a break-even projection with all these costs that said, considering all these costs, how many cups of coffee do I have to sell every single day? I think that number, I see different numbers. Of course, different locations are going to have different rents, different costs, there's so many variables here that it's going to fluctuate. But I'll go and tell you right now, if you're under $500 a day in sales, you're really going to be struggling to cover all of your expenses and make this worthwhile. That is, is it possible? Probably in some realm, some possibility. But that is a very low number of sales to cover all these different costs that you're trying to make sure you get paid. I say that we made a break-even projection. If I could go back and do it again, that was good. And I think it was helpful in the moment just to have a number in our mind. How many sales per day? So every day we kind of knew, are we on the right side of this number or the bad side of this number? If I could do it again, I probably would have more so focused on cash flow over a period of time, maybe like 1 or 2 years. And I say that because coffee is very seasonal. Fall is going to be most likely your busiest time. It's a great time. It's getting colder. People are thinking coffee. They're thinking PSLs. They're thinking all these different drinks, and they're excited to get to their coffee shop and drink a cup of coffee. Whereas hotter months are a little slower. And then, of course, one of our shops or two of our shops is in a university town. And so when the students are gone during summers and breaks, of course, things are a little bit slower. And so a break even projection was a little simple and it worked for us back then. But if I could go back and do it again, and if I could make a recommendation to you, it would be more so map out over the next 12 to 24 months. What sort of sales do we expect? What sort of expenses do we expect? And maybe map out the seasonality a little bit more of it. Summer's maybe a little lower, fall may be a little busier. What would the holidays look like? Different things like that. One other change I would make if I were starting Three Tree again, I definitely would have started with more cash. The question was, how did you feel confident that you would have enough income to cover expenses? It takes usually years for restaurants to become profitable, right? To actually start covering all of their expenses and making money. And we went into starting Three Tree with way too little money. Once again, we didn't really know what we were doing. We were kind of bootstrapping this thing. And I actually looked it up the other day. We had only about $8,000 to $10,000 in the bank when we opened this coffee shop, and that is not enough. I can't believe we did that. That's really risky. That's basically a payroll or more, right there. And so the fear is, thankfully we started with some pretty good momentum, but if you don't start with enough cash, you may not be able to sustain some of those early months and maybe even years where you're just trying to get your name out there, trying to become known. And so I definitely encourage you to have more starting capital, starting cash. There's lots of, there's lots of numbers online that you can find. And a common one I see is 3 months worth of operating expenses. So if it costs you $20,000 a month to run a coffee shop, then you probably want $60,000 in the bank when you open. And I know this sounds like a lot of money, but once again, you're just setting yourself up for success to try and make it through some of those difficult times. And we had many times in those first 2 or 3 years where we were coming up on an expense that had to be paid. And I'm praying, I'm hoping that the money will come in. And it just barely worked time and time again. And then thankfully we started building even more momentum and kind of got out of that hole. So all that to say, run some projections. Don't go into this blind, whether it's a break-even projection, cash flow projection, make sure you're running some numbers. And if you're not comfortable with this, you need to find someone who is. Get someone else on this and make sure that you're mapping out how much is this going to cost and are we prepared for this? And then go in with a good amount of cash. Just make sure you have enough cash to sustain some of those early years. All right, let's move on to another question. This question is great. I'm glad that this was submitted. What this person asked were, what are some of the challenges of going from 1 to 2 locations? Our story is a little strange in this. So we opened our first coffee shop in 2015. So started roasting in 2014, opened our first coffee shop in 2015. And it wasn't until 2020 that we ended up buying a second location. And it was actually an existing coffee shop in Pooler called The Front Porch. It's still a location that we have to this day. It's called Three Tree Coffee at the Porch. And so it's unique for 2 reasons. One, it was an existing coffee shop. We weren't starting from scratch. We were clearly paying more than we would have if we started our own thing, but it kind of comes with, some of the processes. It comes with the space. The lease was already in place. And probably most importantly, it was coming with customers. I mean, customers already knew about that space. So sales were already there and happening. And so we started talking with the owners about this in summer of 2019. I mean, there's a lot of talks that go into this. And it was March 7th, 2020 that we closed on this purchase of our second location in Pooler. We had 1 week that was quote unquote normal. And then the world shut down because of the pandemic. I remember March 13th, 2020, and I will never forget that day. I mean, and you all experienced this too, right? I mean, shutdowns, regulations, masking. I mean, it was just the whole world was turning upside down. And we saw sales drop at our whole business drop by about 70-ish%, a huge drop in sales. And so, of course, we're now floundering. We're scrambling around just like anyone else. And I won't get too much into that story, at least on this podcast. Maybe that's for another day. But I share all that because our second location was not a normal story of a second location. So I don't think there's that much I can share here that would, at least in that story, that would maybe help guide you if you wanted to move from 1 to 2 locations. But there is one thing I'll pull out of this scenario. And that is that if there's one clear lesson that came out of purchasing the store in Pooler, it's that you have very different audiences at different coffee shops and at different cities. I think we thought we had a pretty consistent audience no matter where we would go. And we found that our audience in Pooler was very different. Their desires for drinks were different than what we were used to. Their expectations for customer service were different than what we were used to. The demographic was different than what we were used to. And that affected everything because our whole business was built for a very specific audience out of our first shop. And so I think what I would encourage you to take from this is, let's say you have a coffee shop and you want to open up a second one. Really start to think through, what's the audience for the second location? There will definitely be overlap. I'm sure some things will be similar. There will probably be a lot of things that are different. Are you in a university town or are you not? Do you have a drive-through or not? Because that's going to change the type of clientele that's going to come to you, whether you're ready for it or not. So the type of location you have and the city you're in will most likely change the audience. And you need to think about that ahead of time to say, how am I catering this product to that customer base without changing who we are, right? The other thing that's a huge shift from going from 1 to 2 locations, and this is important. This is so important because I've talked with lots of business owners in coffee and in food service. And this is a difference that a lot of people don't recognize, and it catches them off guard. When you have one coffee shop, you are a trainer. You are training your staff on how to run this coffee shop. When you go to 2 locations, you immediately become a trainer of trainers. And it's such a different mentality. I can't stress how much of a different mentality this is. And this is usually what is so stressful for people that jump into a second location. You're no longer just training, you're training trainers. You are training people then to take it further to their team and their staff. This requires 2 things. You have to be really confident and good at delegation. Remember at the beginning of the episode, I said supervise people and get that experience first. Getting that delegation experience is really important here. Learning how to delegate things well is so important if you're going to have 2 locations because you cannot be everywhere at once. Another really important feature to this is you have to have really, really tight processes. Your processes have to be so clear and consistent, especially your training processes, right? You have to have a process for training. You can't just say, oh, we'll figure it out. We'll teach them as we go. You need to have a very clear script for how do we train the type of employee we want, and let's make sure that we're implementing that at all locations. We did not have good enough processes. Once again, opening the second location with COVID was wild, but we didn't have good enough processes. It was a rude awakening. And I wish I had had a better forethought to say, let's prepare some processes and get that more tight. Some specific processes I wish we had been better prepared for is inventory processes. Our inventory was very loose. It was kind of whoever's ordering, make the call. And clearly that resulted in lots of inconsistencies. It was easy. I'd even say it was lazy on my end, but it created lots of inconsistencies. It resulted in a season where we had tons of waste that was going unseen. That's not a good plan, right? If you're 1 location, you can probably just wing it. 2 locations, you can't. You need good inventory processes. You need good training processes. These processes are so important to ensure that you can replicate this at multiple locations. I think maybe a better way to answer this question would be to say, what was it like from us going from 2 to 3 locations? because that was maybe a more normal worldly example of how that can go down. And that's when we opened up our location on Georgia Southern's campus in Statesboro. And once again, it really was about the processes. We had much better processes going into that one. And even then, they kind of came up short. So just make sure that you have really clear standard operating procedures and make sure that you're ready to start training trainers. If your favorite part of the job is making coffee and seeing customers, you probably don't want to open up another location. If your favorite part of your job is seeing your team accomplish those things and that's rewarding to you, you probably are in a good mindset to open up another location. So great question. Appreciate you submitting that. Let me keep going with another question. Well, this is a good one. I think we'll end it here. It's a loaded question. Of course, from Chris Gohagen. Thank you for the really well thought out question. So Chris, you asked, what is the biggest global challenge and the biggest local challenge in coffee? So the biggest global challenge and the biggest local challenge. Really a great question and an important question because I think there's a lot of questions about the sustainability of this industry as a whole. And they have to do with both of these. What I would say is the biggest global challenge and what I would say is the biggest local challenge. When it comes to a global challenge, coffee farmers are leaving this industry quickly. What you're finding is that, of course, costs are rising and coffee prices have stayed relatively unchanged when it comes to traditional ways of buying coffee. And it's resulting in coffee farmers, at least young generation coffee farmers, saying, I don't want to do this. I don't want to work on a farm all day long to get paid very little. I'm going to move to the city and I'm going to get a better job. And I'm going to work in tech, work in finance. I'm going to get a better job and make more money. And who can blame them, right? But it's certainly concerning for anyone who works in the coffee industry. And it should be concerning for anyone who drinks coffee because more and more farmers are leaving this industry. There was one video that came out about 4 years ago. I sent it to some of our wholesale clients, some of our wholesale partners. It was of this Brazilian coffee farmer who was literally just macheting all of his coffee plants. And he was just chopping them all down. And he did it as a statement to say, this isn't worth it for me anymore. We as buyers, we need to wake up. We need to recognize this. And we need to ask ourselves, is this a product we want moving forward? And there's lots of discussions happening in the coffee industry as a whole right now saying, are we going to have an ample supply of coffee in 10 years? Or are there enough people leaving that we won't have near as much coffee as people would demand or want? So not only are farmers leaving because of rising costs, but a lot of farmers are also leaving because of unpredictable weather. I remember I met with Juan in Mexico. I think it was in 2016 or 2017. He's a coffee farmer down in Chiapas, Mexico. And I asked him this question: what is your biggest challenge as a coffee farmer? And his answer was, the weather over the past 10 years has been the most unpredictable I've ever seen. And he was struggling. There's times he would lose his entire crop because a rain came at the wrong time. Or there's a time that, whole crops can be lost because of an early frost. And so I want to read some of these statistics because in 2022, coffee saw a pretty significant drop in production across the board. Let's see. So Brazil coffee production in 2022 dropped by 7%. And most of this was due to just an early frost. A frost came too soon, sooner than normal. And the result was 5 to 10 million bags of coffee. Each bag is 152 pounds, by the way, give or take some. 5 to 10 million bags of production lost simply because of weather, and a 7% drop in Brazil. Colombia saw a 12% drop in production, and a lot of this was due to unfavorable weather there in 2022. According to the International Coffee Organization, coffee production as a whole decreased by 1.4% in 2022. And that may not sound a lot, but whole percentage points when you're talking about global production is a vast amount of coffee. So the production decreased by 1.4% in 2022, but coffee consumption increased by 4.4%. And this is what we're going to start seeing more and more as farmers leave this industry because it's not worth it. whether it's because of weather or just low prices, you're going to see more and more demand and less supply. The good news is that you think that would drive prices up at some point. Maybe coffee farmers will start getting paid really well on a more traditional, in the more traditional buying methods. And yet it's going to result in the coffee industry being hit, coffee shops closing. I mean, they just can't get the product in to be able to sustain this. And so I would say that's the biggest global challenge facing the coffee industry is farmers are leaving it. And that's one of the reasons, one of the reasons why we want to empower our farmers at Three Tree Coffee. We want to see it as a partnership. We don't want to buy in the traditional way. We want to make sure that our farmers are seen as partners and that they do have a sustainable way to move forward in their industry. And there's some really great organizations that are doing awesome stuff to ensure this. We've talked about fair trade before. Unblended is a really great organization in South Carolina that is really training the next generation on finding a better market for their coffee, maybe doing some experimental fun processes so it's more marketable, and then helping them get that marketed to the States. Thrive Coffee Farmers has a really neat consignment model. So there's some really awesome organizations that are doing things to address this, but it's definitely a global concern. So when it comes to a local challenge in the coffee industry, I would say definitely the biggest challenge over the past year and a half has been inflation. Prices are just rising across the board, right? And I know you feel it, we feel it, and it's putting a really tight squeeze on an industry that already has very, very small margins. I one time gave a presentation to a class at Georgia Southern University, and I took a cup of coffee. There was a visual on the screen. I took a cup of coffee, and I basically broke down that cup of coffee and covered what are the costs that go into making this cup of coffee. And so let's say that this cup of coffee costs $5. Well, about $1.80 of that cup is most likely going to labor, right? Paying the staff that are working for this organization. About $1.50 is probably going to cost of goods sold, as we talked about earlier, the ingredients that goes into making this cup. There's probably another 50 or 60 cents that goes to rent and utilities, things like that. And then there's, of course, a bunch of other costs that are getting swallowed up in this cup of coffee: legal costs, marketing costs, repairs. For those of you who are thinking of opening a coffee shop, stuff breaks. Be prepared for it. It's expensive. So repairs, credit card processing, all these things are extra costs that are eating up what could be made out of this cup of coffee. And the end result is that if you are a wildly successful coffee business, you are probably making as profit about 25 cents per cup of coffee. Of this $5 cup of coffee, about 25 cents is your profit, which profit isn't just the money you get to go play with. That's usually the money that you're reinvesting in your business. You're maybe buying more equipment, or you want to open another location or things like that. And so, that's also a good coffee shop. It gets less than that for sure. I say all that because the margins in coffee are so slim. Restaurant margins are a little better. Of course, there's lots of other industries where the margins are a lot better. There's lots of great things about working in coffee, but it being lucrative is probably not one of them unless you scale to multiple locations and things like that. And so the margins are already small. They're tight. And so with the change we've seen in inflation, of course, our costs have gone up a lot. The cost of ingredients have gone up a lot. That's difficult. A lot of our other costs have gone up because of inflation. Our insurance premiums went up because of inflation. Our taxes went up because of inflation. All these other companies are charging more because of inflation. So a lot of our costs went up, not just the ingredients. And then the biggest challenge of all is we're trying to figure out, how do we pay our staff more? I mean, how do we help our staff get through inflation as well? And all these things has just put an incredible squeeze, at least on our organization. And as I talk with other coffee shop owners as well, it can just be really, really tough. And so the question is, are we ready for $8 to $9 lattes? Are we ready for $8 to $9 cups of coffees? Is the marketplace ready for that? Because that is the direction we're moving. And we've already started seeing prices increase. We've already increased prices, I think, 3 times over the past 2 years. And so you're going to keep seeing this happen as we all try to respond to inflation going out of control. And it's putting into question, is the coffee shop model even sustainable? That all sounds like doom and gloom. And I don't say all this to scare anyone away. I just want to be real, right? Running a coffee shop is pretty darn difficult. And there's lots of questions as we look into the future that say, what does this model look like moving forward? The good news is that I still think there's a space in the marketplace for the coffee shop business. And that's because the coffee shop is so much more than just the cup of coffee that I mentioned earlier. It's the place where you find community. It's maybe the place where you find acceptance. It's maybe the place where you find your best friends. It's maybe the place where you have your brilliant idea and you go start your own business. The coffee shop has always been a symbol for something so much more than just the product. It's the space that can inspire something more. And as humans, we want that. We want that. And that demand is never going to go away. We want spaces where we can connect. We want spaces where we can be inspired. And so I think there's still a space in the marketplace. I don't know what it looks like. Maybe it is $8 or $9 cups of coffees. Maybe it's not. But long story short, I know there's a place in the marketplace for coffee shops. And it's really rewarding. I've shared lots of information that maybe are pushing people away. It costs a lot. It's really difficult. You're supervising people. I'm giving lots of pushback. It is so rewarding. Working in coffee is so much fun and so rewarding. Is it hard work? Absolutely. But it's rewarding and it's fun. Well, to everyone who submitted a question, thank you so much. I didn't even get to all the questions, so we may have to do this again sometime, get some of your questions to continue unpacking this concept of what is it like owning a coffee shop. I did want to ask real quick, if you've been listening to this podcast or watching on YouTube, please like, download, subscribe, follow, click all those buttons, whatever platform you're on. That really helps us get this podcast out to more people, and that would be a big help to me and our team. We're wanting to get this content out to more and more people. And so if you could please do me a favor and just like, follow, subscribe, press some of those buttons, help us out. I hope you're enjoying the content enough to warrant that. And of course, if you want to leave us a review, I'd greatly appreciate that as well. This has been the Coffee and Podcast, and I'm your host, Philip Klayman. I appreciate you joining. We'll see you next time.